Good evening. My name is Thomas Caldwell. I'm the programmer at the Melbourne International Film Festival. I would like to begin by acknowledging that we're gathered on the traditional land of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. Welcome to Telling Other People's Stories, a MIFF Talks event. This year the MIFF Talks program is presented by the University of Melbourne, Faculty of Fine Arts and Music. For information on other events, please visit miff.com.au/talks. Apologies about the slightly late start. That was probably on me. We're going to get going in just a moment, and I think this is going to be a really fascinating panel discussion that's going to happen over the next hour. The person who brought this idea to me, and to which I immediately said yes to, is tonight's moderator, Peniston. She's an award-winning writer-director whose short films have screened at some of the world's most prestigious festivals. Beck's feature screenplay, Petrova, won the Australian Writers Guild Insight Award and has received Screen Australia development funding. Her documentaries include Keith Haring Uncovered for ABC Television and Nick Cave Abusing the Muse, which premiered at MIFF in 2008. Beck is an alumnus of the Berlin International Film Festival's Talent Campus and MIFF's Accelerator program. She directs commercials through Melbourne's Truce Films. It gives me great pleasure to now hand you over to Beck Peniston.
Thank you, Thomas. That was a lovely introduction. May I add my respects, please, to elders past and present of the Kulin Nation and welcome you to this 58th annual, is that right, Thomas? Or 68th? 68th annual Melbourne International Film Festival, which means that this festival began in the early 50s in Olinda. And it's been going ever since, which is so wonderful, I think. It's lovely to have that film history with us. I am very excited to welcome tonight's panel. We are all a little bit terrified. This is not an easy topic to tackle. We're all worried we're going to say the wrong thing, but hopefully nobody's going to hold back. There are no rights and wrongs, but there's a lot of important material that we need to discuss, and we need to discuss much more freely than we do. So may I begin by welcoming on my left here, John Harvey. John is a writer, director and producer, crossing over theatre, documentary and drama. He is here at MIFF this year with his short Out of Range, which is in the MIFF Shorts selection. He was here last year also in the Accelerator program with Water, another short. You also produced the feature film Spear and a chapter of The Turning, which was here at MIFF in 2013 and also at the Berlinale. Welcome, John.
Thank you.
Next up, we have Kay Austen Collins, a film critic for Vanity Fair and a co-host of the podcast Flashback, which I've just discovered, which is terrific exploration of overlooked and forgotten films, which I highly recommend. He also writes crosswords for the New York Times. And you're here at the moment, for the first time in Melbourne, as a guest of the MIFF's Critic Campus, where you're mentoring one of a group of our emerging Australian film critics, which is wonderful. So welcome, Cameron.
Thank you.
Sharon Whippy is next. Sharon is a writer of poetry, prose and short stories and has just made her screenwriting debut, most impressively, with her sister Nicole Whippy, writing one of the scripts for the feature film Vi, which is showing in this year's festival. It was written and directed by 9 Pacific female filmmakers. It tells the story of a Polynesian woman who is played by a different actress at 8 stages of her life. It's premiered at Berlin this year, and quite impressively, each of those short chapters runs for about 10 minutes and is shot as a single continuous take. So fascinating, and I'm really looking forward to seeing that one next week. Welcome, Sharon.
Thank you.
And Sophie Hyde, welcome, director and producer of so many great things. This year's festival, you're premiering Animals, which is a film set in Dublin and which intriguingly has been dubbed as The Whitnell and I for Girls. Before that, you were here at MIFF with Life in Movement, a very moving documentary. You're the creator, director, producer of Fucking Adelaide, which is awesome, and probably on iView if you haven't already seen it. And the forthcoming, in fact, it's already begun, The Hunting for SBS. Also, Sophie was the director of 52 Tuesdays, which is a story of a 16-year-old girl whose mother reveals plans to gender transition. Welcome, Sophie.
Thank you.
So why are we having this conversation? Obviously, we're in a time and in a place where our society is quite diverse. Our screens are not yet particularly diverse. The statistics are not awesome. In terms of disability, we're wildly underrepresented. I think we have roughly 4% main characters are disabled versus 18% of the population. LGBTQI, 5% representation versus 11% of our population. Ethnic, non-Anglo-Saxon, 18% versus 32% in reality. And Indigenous, I don't have a statistic except that I'm told it's improved dramatically in the last couple of years, thanks to the work of a few local production companies, I'd say the ABC and some of the agencies' programs. But the fact is, we still are underrepresented, and then also the representation that we see on screen is sometimes clumsy. It has traditionally been framed through a pretty middle-class white male gaze, and certainly there's been criticisms of it being uninformed, reductive, exoticised, parodied, or tokenistic. So, John, I would like to start with you. You know, we're part of a country whose culture actually holds the oldest stories ever in history. How did we get to this point in time? Why are we in this situation?
Well, I guess we're here because, you know, the Kulin people, and I'd like to pay my respect to the people of the Kulin Nation and their elders past and present, and elders here tonight. And we're here because people held stories for this country for a very long time, and we sit with the privilege of knowing that people have made enormous sacrifices, not of their own want, and we all sit upon that. We all sit on Kulin country here, and you know, it is a pleasure to be here. But that's certainly where we start from, I guess.
And how does that, how are you aware of that in approaching your own work? How has it influenced you in terms of the sort of stories you tell and the way you tell them?
It's about relationships with people, you know, and it's about relationships with people here or wherever I'm telling stories. And it's about the understanding of that inherent, I suppose, you know, with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures, many Indigenous cultures, you know, there's oral history has been, you know, a big part of the storytelling, and things aren't written down. And so, you know, for example, in this country, you know, the things that were written around invasion were by white, well-to-do men. You know, there's a big side of the history of this country that isn't there. And it's just about being aware of that. It's about being aware of how story sits for our communities and what is the significance of story for our people that we pass on to our children as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and that inherent right that we have to tell our children our stories. And the way that that's done, the freedom of how we do that, is important considerations when you're bringing in particularly a film kind of process into that, and to be really aware as a filmmaker when you're doing that.
Yeah.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that answers my question, absolutely. Can I jump over to you, Sharon? How do we make space for minority voices while fostering greater diversity in the mainstream?
That's a really good question. I think what it takes is a team effort, and I mean at all levels of in the creative industry, in the film industry. The way that we foster emerging artists, Indigenous emerging artists, to tell stories, giving them the space to be able to do that, supporting them to be able to do that. Our stories are good, so there's no reason for them to be part of the mainstream. I feel a little bit uncomfortable about the idea of minority, you know, as a term to describe voices that are actually just underrepresented for various reasons, well, most of them that we know. So I think it's an effort through our creative institutions, the government, through education, through providing accessibility to films that do show Indigenous stories so that we can see ourselves reflected in the world. Yeah, and I think sharing those journeys as well, letting others know that it's possible to do this. And yeah, it's really gathering around, pulling together. I don't think it can't exist in a vacuum. It needs everybody to be involved.
And would you like to see mainstream filmmakers and storytellers better representing, or increasing the representation of marginalised ethnicities, for instance?
I don't know what you mean, like...
So part of the challenge is to give support to nurture voices from the margins, say. Part of it too is, I think, to encourage people who are telling mainstream stories to mainstream Australia over and over to make that a more diverse offering in terms of characters and stories. So I guess my question is, apart from encouraging filmmakers, Indigenous filmmakers to tell Indigenous stories, how do we encourage non-Indigenous filmmakers to also tell those stories, or should we not?
I vacillate between two different perspectives on that. And one part of me thinks that we've had enough of other people telling our stories and the telling of those stories through that lens, that dominant lens. And then the other part of me acknowledges that we need to be able to move forward in some way. And what does that mean? In terms of collaboration, connections with community and people. Yeah, so I really move between those two spaces, and because it's just so complex. But as a Pacific Island woman, I see, when I come to watch something, I immediately ask who created it, because that's how I'll watch it.
Interesting.
That's how I'll watch it, and I've started doing that more and more now.
Yeah.
And if it's an Indigenous story that's not told by an Indigenous person, then I'll watch it like that.
Awesome. Sophie, tell me, what do you think? Should we stick to writing stories and worlds that we know ourselves and have experienced ourselves?
This is such a difficult question. I do want to
This is not a test, by the way.
Tiny second to first acknowledge a couple of things. One is, like, I'm from the land of the Kaurna people. That is the land that I've worked on and lived on for my whole life. You know, a land of people that were they're heavily disadvantaged and colonised, and yet, you know, it means a lot to me to be able to work on that land. I also just want to acknowledge the feminist women and the queer people that raised me, and how important that is in the life that I have. And also just a couple of other people, which are the Aranda community and the Garawa community, and the three producers that worked with me on a film called In My Blood It Runs, which is also playing here at MIFF, which is a film about Aranda and Garawa community, and the three producers, Larissa Brent, Maya Newell and Rachel Edwardson, who have called me out and taught me a great deal about how I feel about this over the last couple of years as we've made that movie. I think this is really hard, because I'm going to come to this and speak as a woman first, and that is that, you know, in Australia only 16% of feature films are made by women. In the rest of the world, that's even less. In some places, it's only 4%. Now, that's a tiny, tiny portion of stories. So that means that if we take the good numbers, that means that 84% of films are being made by men in Australia, do you know? And, you know, we're not talking about a minority there at all. We're talking about a majority of humans. When I think about that and I go, I would like to see women telling stories. I think the place we want to get to is women having a voice that we can hear, is First Nations people having a voice that is like telling the stories that I'm dying to hear, you know, I want to hear. People that live with disabilities or identify as disabled, you know, telling stories. These are the stories I want to hear. At the same time, as we're getting there, there's many reasons that all of us are not at the table, and, you know, why do we not have the power to speak? Who is in the room? Why are other people not in the room? All these questions that we have to keep asking. But in the meantime, do I not want there to be women as protagonists on screen because there's not female filmmakers telling the story? I'm not sure. For me, what's important is who tells the story. I come from a filmmaking background, and so of course, the person telling the story is the author and is the voice of the work. But I, you know, also want young girls to see girls on screen. And if there are only 16% of films made by women, I want women to be on more than 16% of those screens. So it's a really tricky thing. I think it is about noticing who's telling the stories as the first thing, recognising that the story is told from a distinct point of view, and that white male stories are not the neutral stories. They have a point of view, they are political, they're not just entertainment, and that all of those other stories, like my films are often called women's stories, but they are equally, you know, a part of a human experience as films about men, yeah. You know, it's really messy and fraught what we're talking about here. You know, it's a really tricky, do I step aside and hand over to somebody that has less power than me or has less privilege? I recognise the privilege I have to sit here and tell stories, and I recognise that it's important that all of our voices are heard, but there are a lot of people who aren't being heard.
Yeah, well, that was my next question, which was, as a director, are there projects that you would love to do, but you would consider you're not the best person to take on those projects?
Yeah. There's loads of stories. I definitely feel like I have to connect to a story, and I have to have some feeling of authentic reason that I can tell it in some form, whatever form that is. There have been things that I've been asked to do that I feel like are wrong for me to do personally, but that doesn't mean that there are stories that I wouldn't tell that aren't necessarily my story. But certainly in that sort of sense of how you tell a story, then I would be looking for people to come along in that storytelling process with me that would be able to be there for other reasons than mine, you know, that would have the value, the experience of the people that are inside the story, or have ways of thinking creatively and in terms of the narrative that I might not think about. So I guess it's about, in telling other people's stories, inviting the right people that have value and can speak, and valuing their experience to be in the room. Yeah.
Cameron, that Sophie raised an interesting point there about power and who has the power to tell a story that might not otherwise be told. You'll probably hate me bringing up the film Green Book because it's been written about and discussed endlessly, but I do feel like this conversation was given a bit of heat earlier this year when that film received an Oscar. And I just wonder, is that a film that would have been better told by someone else? And could it have been?
Well, Green Book is complicated because the screenwriter, Nick Vallelonga, was writing, you know, the story of his father. His father is the main character, is the driver in the movie. And
literally.
Yeah, right. And so in a way, there's no better claim to ownership over that story that I can think of than writing the stories, you know, a film about the stories that I listened to as a kid. I mean, my issue with that movie was that when it came, you know, when it came to the black character in that film, it was just based on things that I was less sure about, you know, based on conversations that we didn't really have access to a means of understanding a black character and America's relationship to his race that was recounted by the white character who was there with him at the time to his son. So it's third hand in a way. And my sense with that movie was that there were dimensions of that racial experience that neither of the Vallelonga, neither father nor son really understood about the black male's character, or his experience, his feelings about his own race. I mean, it's a movie in which, for people who haven't seen it, this is someone who has conflicted feelings about his racial and class status relative to other black people, relative to an economically lower class white person, et cetera. And those are powerful, loaded, honest things. It is completely normal for people to have complicated feelings about their identity, but that's tricky stuff that you probably want to hear from them. And my complicated feelings about Green Book, which I thought was in the scenes that felt true to Vallelonga's father's story, funny, heartwarming, I guess. But in the depiction of the black character was a little suspicious to me, and that's complicated because it's. Vallelonga rightly says, this is just me making a movie about the stories that my dad was telling me when I was a kid, and this is really me making a movie about my father. This is the main character, the other guy is the supporting character, and so it's hard to say to someone that they shouldn't tell that story. Really, I think the responsibility was because this is a movie that is about racial difference, because it's happening in a Hollywood context where it is very easy to map this narrative of reconciliation and friendship onto the story, that you want, I think, people to be scrutinized a little bit in their choices here before they make the movie. But in the sense, for me, I think my ideal is one in which there are enough underrepresented people making the stories that they want to make, and there's enough equity in that sense that if there are movies like Green Book, they're almost less important because there are other people telling better stories and better movies. There's just no way to get rid of mediocre movies or mediocre art, and that's just that's a part of the ecology of art. There's always good, there's always bad. So for me, it's not about Green Book not existing. It's more about the institutional structures that make that the story that gets the Oscar campaign, that gets all the funding, that gets the second movie project, that gets the Oscars, et cetera. That system. If we had better versions of that movie told by more diverse people, then I wouldn't really care about Green Book. And the ideal for me is one in which anyone gets to, if Catherine Bigelow wants to make war movies, politically it's weird movies. But in theory, I want women to make movies about men if they want to. I want authors like Kazuo Ishiguro writing The Remains of the Day about a white butler. I don't want to tell artists what they can't imagine. I just want institutional structures that make it possible for everyone to get to do that imagining and manifesting that imagination into art. And getting the plaudits and the funding and running the studios and making the choices and doing the casting and doing that work, right? Ideally, someone could be making a show like Game of Thrones and have so many different kinds of directors at their disposal that you don't just sort of wind up with a lineup of white directors for that show. Because that's ultimately, just in practical terms, that's just what I want. I want little black kids who like anime to go do that, to make that movie if they want. But I also want, Japanese kids to make anything that they want. And really, for me, it's about the power structures. It's about more diverse people in leadership positions, giving out funding, deciding who gets to direct, deciding who gets to write. That kind of equity is what I'm really interested in. And then we can have the conversations about which art is better. And then it can be that kind of conversation, and we can be who's being responsible and who's not. And if they're not being responsible, here are 10 other movies that are better that you don't even have to talk about Green Book if you don't want to. That's the ideal.
That sounds awesome.
Yeah, it sounds great.
So what needs to change, or is change afoot? Do you feel like we're moving in the right direction?
It's complicated to say. I mean, I think worldwide, we are, first of all, a lot more attuned to the structural problems of all of this. I think that you have, even when people talk about festival lineups, there's always now a conversation about, you know, if someone is the first Black woman to have a film compete at Cannes in 2019, or if someone is the only woman with a film at Venice in a particular year. Now there's a robust conversation about that. But of course, if the people running these things are sort of there until they die, it becomes harder. You know, so like for all the ways that there's progress and for all the ways there are people who are acquiring positions of leadership and wanting to, you know, accrue money and give it out and be more equitable in this sense, there are also just people in power who aren't going anywhere. And I think it takes a number of things. I mean, something I think a lot about is what if something that happened in New York just now is because of very complicated political ties going on at the Whitney Museum, just a number of artists pulled their work out of the Whitney Biennial as a statement. And I think about, you know, what if a bunch of directors who'd gotten into Cannes said, we will not let our film play at Cannes if not for X, Y, Z. Like, it's a complicated thing. I picked Cannes because that's a festival where there are a lot of veteran directors. It's harder to say that to kind of younger debut people who are, you know, rightly concerned about what could happen to their careers. But veteran directors, I think if you've been at Cannes 11 times, you're getting in with films about people who aren't you, I think that you are more than equipped and more than responsible for boycotting something like that. Like, you know, scaring the people in power into making these choices. It's just weird that we have given years where on the festival circuit you just don't get that kind of representation, because at other festivals, at like this festival, for example, you do have that representation. So when there are other international festivals who aren't up to task in that way, it's strange, because they're all the same movies circulating at the same time, and everyone's making choices. And I think by, you know, just by, even as journalists, by always talking about that, by artists, as artists, by always pointing that out, and really investigating whether or not you have the power to take a stand in those moments and pull your own work out of things or divert funding to other people. I think that it's time that we all do that. I think that's just a pretty straightforward way to get the people who, again, aren't going anywhere until they die, short of killing them. Like, you know, I think that we can just scare them into having to reorient themselves all the time. And I think that we're all getting better at that, but I think that these things can be really slow, and I also think that things like funding and money and et cetera are deeply complicated. But I think that we, you know, I think we are getting better at this. I think it's going to take a while to see it systemically shift, but I think that we're headed in the right direction and just need to be more aggressive.
John, do you agree? Or do you think the same is true here in Australia? Do you think we're moving in the right direction? And how useful, how do you perceive the institutional structures in terms of either aiding or inhibiting?
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to think we are moving in the right direction. I mean, a pretty optimistic person. Sometimes things happen that make me question that. But I suppose, you know, like in terms of a structure thing, like I suppose this is where we need to think about how we use film to tell our stories, and that different cultures have different ways of approaching story. And like I did a film Spear that you mentioned, and we couldn't get funding from the state agencies because we didn't have a script. We didn't have a 70-page script, even though state agencies love the people, love the idea, would love to support it. The computer said no.
And Spear's a dance-based piece.
Oh, yeah, sorry,
Yeah.
yes, I should say that,
Yeah.
that it's a dance piece, and Stephen Page from Bangarra Dance Theatre directed it. And so it was never going to have 70 pages. Like, we were never going to have that. And it struck me that I suppose as colonial kind of systems that are in place, government systems, that for us as storytellers, here's a form of our storytelling which is very important to us, but wasn't eligible to be getting funding from a screen agency. And I think it's, you know, those kind of things, like, you know, there are things we need to think about. and you know, because that's just about going, well, how do you look at the form of story, and what place you come from when you look at that? Because that's a very Western sense of looking at using this medium, and you just need to clock that, you know, and then make changes so that it is more accessible, so that you can get those diversity of story and storytellers. Like I always think, like with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, we have amazing storytellers, you know, we have incredible storytellers and who have been telling stories, holding stories in our communities for years, and who we look towards to hold our stories and keep our stories. And, you know, as a medium, how is this medium accessible, you know, to those storytellers? And, you know, and then it makes me wonder about what is the colonial impact of that if we are taking a Western view of the medium and how to use it. You know, like with visual art, you know, like for things to be considered Indigenous art, it doesn't have to be dots and cross-hatching. There was a phase where that kind of happened, and the market wanted that too. It was like, give us your indigeneity in this, and because I want to hang it up on my wall, and we want to see people in a way that reinforces our own beliefs, and that's cool, but that's not who we are as people, you know. And no disrespect to artists who have done that work too, because people have got to eat. But I think, you know, like I wonder about that too, like, you know, and I think of like, you know, like Vernon Arkey's work and like with text, you know, and there's these amazing visual artists who do this incredible work, and, you know, the work and the voice is Indigenous because that's who they are as an artist, you know, not by the form. And so I think, you know, yeah, I mean, I think that's probably a discussion for us to have. It's, you know, and I guess, you know, accessing departments generally, government bureaucracies, isn't easy for people, and people can grow up with a particular experience with government and government bureaucracies that isn't a positive one. And so when film places still represent the government, you know, it's still the voice of the government that's talking to you. And I think, you know, it's a necessary mechanism, but in terms of relating to people who have been pushed by the government or pushed onto an island, told to shut up, pushed onto a mission, told to shut up, pushed wherever, all around the place and told to shut up, we just need to be a bit aware about that, I reckon. Because it's, yeah.
And as a producer, how easy is it to just make work happen outside those agencies, those government agencies? Can we just do without them?
As a black producer, it's pretty tough. It's pretty tough. Yeah. I mean, you know, and those agencies, and, you know, Screen Australia's Indigenous department has done extraordinary work, and, you know, the state agencies have made steps towards that, which is really positive as well. But, you know, the fact of the matter is that the wealth that's been attained off this country isn't afforded back to the people, the First Nations. Like, that's the country that we live in. So even though that wealth is there, little comes back. And filmmaking isn't a cheap art form either. You know, it's not, it's a very expensive art form to be involved in that does require a lot of money.
And if you think about the cultural imperative of a screen agency to tell, you know, to ensure that Australian voice is, or that Australian culture is reflected on our screens, which is, you know, in my opinion, what our screen agencies are there for, because, you know, the more we look at it as a business, the more we get outside of that. But if it's a cultural imperative, then it's failing if it's not having the people telling the stories that are representative of the culture that exists here, I think. And that means working out how to get those people into the room and how to get them to be telling stories the way that they need to be telling stories, not the way that has traditionally that we've traditionally told film stories in Australia.
Yeah, and it's in our DNA to suppress those stories. Like we do that today by shipping people off to remote islands, not allowing media in there, not allowing doctors in there. Like we do that as a nation. Like we know that. We know that we don't want stories to be told. That makes us not feel very good about ourselves, you know? And that is in our DNA as a country. So in order to tell stories from diverse backgrounds, whatever those backgrounds are, there's a lot of self kind of questioning that has to happen for people in positions of power. And, you know, sometimes Australians don't like to be uncomfortable.
Often. Yeah, it's a tricky one too, because also at the end of the day, we're not in a purely art form, we're also in a commerce form, aren't we? And we need to sell tickets. People need to buy tickets to see our films, so we have to find a way to help people get past that discomfort in order to want to hear or to respond to those stories that have been suppressed or
Absolutely.
buried.
People need to buy tickets, but, you know, we do have, like, they're cultural agencies, they're arts agencies, you know. People aren't being fired because they've made poor investments as government agencies into a film that didn't make money. Like, they're not studios, they are government agencies that we pay for as taxpayers, and that should reflect the diversity of voices within our country, you know.
Sharon, what's your take on this? You've been very quiet.
Yeah, there's a lot to listen to. There's lots of interesting ideas. Just speaking to what you just finished saying, with Vi, we really had the New Zealand Film Commission come to our party and support us and the producers to get this done. And the impact of it, and I'm not sure of it in monetary terms, but the impact culturally for our art, for Pacific Islanders, what it's going to do, what it has done for our communities back home has been huge. And it will continue to. So yeah, just speaking to that, the cultural value of what we do as well,
So
aside from
was that
money.
a case of the agency actually introducing an initiative that brought you guys together, or how was
Well, the
project?
idea was really the producer's idea. You know, this is something they've done with their previous feature, Waru, right? So it was the same idea to bring female writer-directors together. With Waru, they were Māori, and there were certain restrictions we needed to have. With Waru, it was Māori characters, main characters, were front and centre stage of the stories. For us, it was our cast and our main characters. We were Pacific Island women, Indigenous. Our stories needed to be set back at home. So there were certain things that kind of fostered that whole project that just gave back to community, gave to us, gave to the filmmaking industry in New Zealand, and it's been amazing. I mean, you know, just when you have people saying to you how incredible it is to actually be able to see Pacific Island women. And, you know, this is 2019, right? Pacific Island women on screen as main characters, speaking their languages, and the impact of that is having on our families, our women, our children, our girls. It's huge. There was a really interesting question we were asked in one of the interviews that we did, and which was really, once we've reflected, was really kind of potent. And that was the idea of, what do you think it would have been like for you as a young girl if you had been able to see Vi? And when that was put to me, I just immediately started crying, because that's my go-to at the moment with this sort of thing. But yeah, it was just suddenly like, my God, I don't know. What would that have been like? And I can't tell you what it would have been like. I have no idea. That it's not my lived experience.
Wow.
So,
and can you tell us a little bit more about that collaboration? Because you had 8 other writer-directors from 8 different islands So on the one hand, you're all Pacific Islander women, but on the other hand, you must have a lot of diversity within that group and different
definitely.
perspectives and sensibilities. Did that come out in the end product, but also in the process?
Yeah, absolutely. And when you watch the film, you can see the diversity, very distinct cultural spaces, countries.
So other than Fiji, what do we have?
So we have Fiji, we have Tonga, we have the Solomon Islands, we have Samoa, we have a perspective from a New Zealand-born Samoan. We have Niue, and we have the Cook Islands. And then, of course, we have New Zealand Māori perspective as well. And Tonga. Yeah, did I say Tonga? Yeah, there's so many, right? But just, it's been extraordinary. And it's interesting because any other Pacific Island woman could have told these stories, but they would have been different. So just that in itself, right?
Yeah.
Speaks to the fact that there isn't one perspective, even when we're coming from that perspective. They would have been different stories. It would have been a different film, a different story.
And your own relationship to Fiji is interesting because you were born there, but then you were raised in Auckland, but maintain this connection.
Yeah.
So did you feel welcome? Did you feel that Fiji welcomed you with open arms?
Yeah, they did.
Yeah.
Because we were really frightened. We are Fiji-born. We're what you call Kailoma, which is like part Fijian, and part, we've got a whole lot of other cultures mixed in there. But we grew up in New Zealand. We don't know how to speak Fijian. So our story needed to be as Fijian as it could be for us. And we did. We had to do that because we knew that it was eventually going to go home. Our community was going to be watching this, and they would be the first ones to call us on any kind of, crap that we put out there if it wasn't sort of... So it had to be our story.
So for it to be authentic, did you need to turn to family, to other members
We
of
just went
the
straight
Fijian
back to our experience, and that was of leaving.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. But it's interesting because in that telling, we reconnected, right?
Yeah.
About the community back home. And we found that actually that story was beyond just us and Alex. It's so many people's stories.
Wow.
Leaving, having to say goodbye, sacrifices that you make, for the idea of better life, better future for your family. And so it was extraordinary how the ripple of that story is really, it's massive, right? It's global. So
authenticity obviously is a big part of this discussion in terms of creating work that looks and feels authentic. Sophie, tell me a bit about how you created your transgender character, James, for 52 Tuesdays.
I haven't talked about that in a long time.
I know, it's been a while, but it's really interesting to hear you talk about it. I have heard you talk about it before, and I'm interested both in the writing the character and then also casting someone and how that evolved.
Yeah, I mean, any kind of gender diversity is something that is an interesting thing to tap into, because as I've sort of lived inside speaking about gender diversity and grown in my own experience of it, I think it's something where, for me, the binary idea of gender is an unsatisfying idea for many, many people. And I feel that people who live, that are transgender or are very out loud about their gender expression are right at the forefront of something that is important for many, many of us that kind of fly unknown, in the world about this. So in terms of exploring gender, and that's the position that I came from, was that I wanted to explore what it was like for somebody who felt like they were in the wrong gender and they wanted to shift that gender. And I knew that we needed somebody in the role that had an experience of gender that wasn't mainstream or traditional. And so the person that we used that we cast was someone that was considered themselves gender neutral, rather than someone that had the same experience as our character, which was a transgender man. And that was just simply, you know, we started working with that person as a consultant originally. We were just talking to a lot of people about their varied experience of gender. And then it morphed very quickly into being that they could come on as an actor. And the whole cast are first-time actors, or new actors, so that wasn't a huge leap. And so, you know, we had teenagers on screen who were playing teenagers, and this gender-neutral actor who was playing a trans actor. But it was still a process of learning, huge process of learning, and kind of the amazing thing about the trans experience at that time, it was before it had become something that was really out in the world to the degree it is now. But there was still all this amazing first-person material about being trans and about being a trans mother in particular, so a trans man that was a mother. And these were things that we drew on and people that we spoke to a lot and we tried to uncover. And then, you know, like always in a story like this, I was tapping into my experience as a young person growing up and meeting my family and my parents as themselves for the first time. The story is very much from the teenager's point of view, although they're both sort of central characters. And then my experience as a parent of a child and how much I would reveal of myself to my child. So that character isn't just a trans character, but certainly I wasn't going to ignore the fact that I'm not a transgender man. And so I needed to be listening to other people as well in that. So complicated.
Super
like
complicated.
Everything. Yeah.
How are we going for time, Thomas? Is it time to throw for questions? Okay. Has anyone got any questions? Because we might just see. And if not, well, I'm happy to keep going. Yeah, we've got a question in the second row here. Just behind you. And then I'll come to you. Yep.
Hi, I was just wondering whether the rest of the panel might talk a bit more about listening, because this is about telling other people's stories. But I think in order to tell other people's stories, you also need to listen to that other experience, which Sophie talked about there. And I think that, I mean, even if you're telling the stories of your own culture through your own experience, you're always telling other people's stories and other people's experiences, and in order to understand them, you need to listen. So I was just interested to hear other people's thoughts.
Listening,
I've been toying with an idea for a story, and on the surface, it's based on our gods from back home, right? And they're stories that are shared openly in between Fijians and you know, tourists that visit Fiji. And so I wanted to bring those stories, really bring them back to life again, right? When I started to dig, I realised that there are villages in Fiji where people trace their lineages back to these beings. And I know that if I was ever to go there, and the idea freaks me out completely, but I would have to do I would have to go home, and I'd have to do a lot of listening to a lot of people, and a lot of asking. But yeah, it would involve, and I can't move beyond, I can't start telling those stories or even entertain the idea until I do that. That's something I feel absolutely obliged to do. Yeah, lots of listening.
Great. Gentleman here in the third row.
By telling other people's stories where we can move past the ideal benefits of telling other people's stories, for example, just representation and getting their stories out there, how do we make sure that they have the material benefits of releasing their stories out there? For example, giving them a portion of the profit that the film made and making sure that the community themselves are materially benefiting from getting their stories out there.
It's a tricky one because I don't think many films make profits in this country, do they?
It's true. So the film that we made, In My Blood It Runs, is made with Aranda and Garawa families. Those families they invited Maya, the filmmaker, into their communities for many, many years before the film started being made. We've questioned a great deal about, you know, what it means to be telling a story that belongs to someone else, and so asking how creatively we can hand over the idea behind the messaging and the storytelling, and so there's a big process around that, and it's really important that that community are the ones in control of the cut and the way it's released and all of those things. And equally, there was always a really strong, even though it's unlikely that the film will ever make a profit, that is inherent in the structure of the financing, is that we didn't have anyone that could take the power away, so that if the family didn't want the film to be seen, we didn't have anyone who could argue against that, so we kind of protected it. And then B, that they have a large portion of any profit that's made, but not only profit, but kind of anything that's coming back from the release is kind of is written into all the structures of that document. I think it's really crucial. Because and they also have, you know, directing credits on the film, so it's not just financial but also authorial control, I suppose. Yeah.
I think they're really important, those aspects, and I've produced a film here called Warbita Bununu, Water Shield. It screened last night, and the director for that film, it's his family, you know, and telling the story, and he had, like, we were able to tell this story, and the kind of way we were talking about it today, actually, this morning, and it was kind of like, you know, you prepare the dance ground so that it's ready for telling the story, you know, for doing the dance, and he had done that work over the past, I don't know, decade or so by doing stuff around storytelling, by understanding how the nature of stories and how they exist within the community. Then if you take that and put it in a film context, how that translates, and also talking to people through that process. And, you know, there's a big kind of, I guess, communication around that. And even, like, you know, as we're acknowledging, you know, we're always telling people's story, and you know, particularly when you're doing your own mob, you've got a lot of eyes and ears on you, and to do it right, and to present something that doesn't surprise people. So often too, like, you know, people may not be used to being involved in a filmmaking process, and so it's about that consultation, you know, right through the whole filmmaking process and release of a film, that people are aware of that, and making sure that people are aware of those kind of processes. Also thinking about the structure of film and what people are giving to the film, because, you know, people are very generous and giving, and think about, well, can that be something that can be a line item in a budget, you know, that people can get paid for their time, for their expertise, you know, and certainly authorship, you know, and, you know, how are people being acknowledged in that authorship?
Cameron, you're nodding a lot there. Is that
I'm just
is that a
agreeing.
possibility? Do you think?
Yeah, I don't see why these things aren't possible. As long as filmmakers themselves and the people that they're collaborating with work to, first of all, also become producers and have the kind of power to do this work, I don't see why it isn't possible. It's certainly not something that's going to happen from top down in terms of industries, but I think from below, with the people with their hands on these stories, I think that's exactly where it should be happening. And I think, I mean, this is a way to also just get more people into the industry, and to get them credits, and to get them experience, and to get them interested, and to get more people who see these movies interested. And that's all, you know, part of the process, I think, of sustaining this.
And in terms of representation, I mean, it's true, like, you know, I'm so overseeing films about, like, strong women, as though strong women is the thing we've all been waiting to see. Do you know, like, it's got to go beyond representation of just having more women on screen, more First Nations people on screen, to being more interesting stories with depth and nuance and varied point of view, I think.
Yeah, and not letting certain cultural institutions and tastemakers homogenize everything, but really getting people to encourage and incentivize just a wide range of stories about specific groups of people. It's just pretty wild how often we get the same stories about the same, demographic of people when we know those people and we know there's so many of them. Some are good, some are bad, some are assholes, some are angels. But we seem to keep getting the same, I think it comes back to what you were saying earlier, the stories that reiterate the things that we want to see about people, which is the thing I think a lot about, just how do we even it just winds up being a lot of the same stuff. It's just boring for us, and it gets further and further away from being about the people that these things are actually about when they're these idealized tropes of people.
And similarly, like, I felt like growing up, I was saying this the other day, I understood the experience of being like a white middle-aged guy who was in love with a young woman, like super well, like as a young woman.
Yeah.
Because all the literature I ever read was like that.
Yeah.
And then I was like, but I'd never understood the feeling of like giving birth or like all sorts of things that I didn't have any way of relating to. And so I grew up identifying with white men super strongly and being able to watch their stories and like feeling myself in them, And when the same is asked back, it's not always easy. No. Yeah.
Nice.
With Vi, we're going to take Vi back to each of the countries that it was filmed. And part of that, as well as that, will be each of the writer-directors we'll be running digital storytelling workshops with the communities, right, and the kids too. So in some way, giving back and also, supporting our community back home. We're really, really excited about that.
Wonderful. Okay, there's a lady in the second row here who had a question.
Hello. You've since kind of touched on my question, but I guess as a young person sitting here, I'm 21, and I think I'm kind of the target audience of like a lot of the stuff you're directly talking about. And I guess I don't really have a question. I more have something I would like to pose to you.
Awesome.
Is maybe the solution just to talk to more young people, because I feel like I have a lot of the answers that you guys are wondering about. And maybe I would give you a few resources. Like, you guys should look into Gabby Dunn. And Gabby Dunn, she's like a bipolar, bisexual creator in the States, and she's doing lots of work that has like kind of saved my life. And there's Jamila Jamil, who is on The Good Place, and she's an actor, and she is very outspoken about all these issues. And you just kind of have to look into the digital age at the moment, because this is kind of the most divided the world has. Oh, that's not true. It's more like, it's just like the digital age has perverted us with so much information that we don't know what to do with it. And I just feel like the generation gap is just so much bigger than it ever was before. Like, old people and young people are being so disconnected because the old people look down on the young people and they're like, oh, all they do is take selfies, and millennial has become a buzzword. But it's just like, where's the compassion? I feel like that's just what the world is lacking at the moment. I don't really have a question, I'm sorry.
So from a young person's point of view, you're saying we should ask you more questions and listen?
I feel like I should be on the panel and I should be paid to do it.
Well, let's pretend you are. So do you feel, what do you think the answer is here in terms of increasing diversity and increasing authenticity of diverse voices on screen?
Give me money so I can finish my 2 films. I'm an actor, I'm a writer, I do casting, I produce, I'm 21. I'm bisexual, I'm bipolar, I'm Asian, I'm a woman, I'm Australian. I could go on, but it's just like, I don't know, I'm just like, feel like I'm wasting time finishing my degree, and I'm sitting next to my lecturer.
So that doesn't directly answer the question, though.
Yeah,
the question is, what would you like to see as an industry, things happening differently? Do you feel like we need to open the way for more diverse voices? Is that what you're saying? Or
I think we're getting really stuck on equality. I don't think equality is good enough at this stage. I think it's about equity. There's like this diagram that is posted in primary schools, which is of these 2 people trying to watch a baseball game. One's tall, one's short, and there's 3 diagrams. And the first diagram is both of them standing at a fence that's the same height, and the little person can't see the baseball game, and that is inequality. And then the equality is represented by the tall person seeing over the fence, and then the smaller person standing on 2 boxes. And then the last diagram is equity, and that's when the fence is removed and instead there's a glass barrier, so it's completely transparent and you can see right through it, and then everyone can see the baseball game.
Awesome. Equity. So, well, I think we would all agree that equity is highly desirable. I guess the question is, how do we get there?
You touched on it. You were talking about accessibility. That's really what it is. But you have to be accessible for intersectional people, and I hope everyone knows what that means. If you don't, please Google it. It's not my job to tell you. Do your own research.
Yeah, it's all well and good, but if it's not accessible by, you know, communities and the people that, and by everybody, then, you know, I don't know, what's the point?
Well, intersectionality is also an interesting thing to talk about. The idea that, you know, people have more than one aspect to their personality and their perspective, and that somebody can be a mixture of genders, of sexualities, of ethnicities, and in those different combinations have unique perspectives on things, and for that reason can have different types of stories they want to tell and connect to different stories in different ways. So I think that's certainly an interesting thing to consider. Thank you. Anyone up the back? I feel like I've been favouring the front here. Yes, there's somebody with their hand up high there.
Hi, my name is Sharon Clanton, and I'm a Wangathi Amiji Noongar Gidja woman from Wajak Noongar Budja. Thank you very much for your discussions and contributions today. There's two parts to the questions that I wanted to pose to the panel, one of which I find quite problematic as an Indigenous content creator and also working across various fields in the production of our stories and what the landscape looks like. I think the frustrating part is often white feminism used as the beacon for progression without including Black and Indigenous narratives and histories, and that the problem has been that consultation is not consent. In terms of challenging that paradigm, and how you deconstruct that colonial lens, what solutions can we be able to start to think about, to actively incorporate in the decolonising process. The second part is often one which probably why I grapple with. I don't know why I'm so emotional.
It's an extremely emotional territory for many people.
Yes,
don't
I
apologise for that. We're very sympathetic.
Is because this country loves to label things as too difficult. Says that it's complicated, which I've heard in the room and on the panel. And I think the frustration is that as Indigenous peoples, we deal with the difficulty and with the uncomfortable truths every single day. That often white content creators, producers, executives, heads of networks, funding bodies, dare not grapple with at times, or if they do, it's in a tokenistic approach. So what I'm asking in the second part is how can we start shifting the conversations to start having mature, honest, transparent, discursive dialogue about the history of this country, about the constant colonising lens that is used to be the face of Indigenous filmmaking, and how is it that we can hold these people to account? And I use this as an example. For example, one of the key producers for a film, which is programmed currently at MIFF, won Venice Film Festival. She came to me directly in terms of, so it's not just the writing aspect, it's a casting, a network, and funding, and then the final cut, and then the delivery. she came to me and asked me, because Indigenous mob dropped out of the film, whom she may know, whom I may know, that she would able to be using the film as representatives of Indigenous Tasmanians. Now, often Australia thinks that the only pure or last bastions of traditional ways of life or ways of being are existent within the Northern Territory. After unpacking a lot of the dialogue with her about the historical landscape and context of the country, which is not my country, she then proceeded, I gave her a list of names. She then proceeded to say, well, they don't look Aboriginal enough.
Oh.
And then I said, well, the landscape is that Northern Territory Aboriginals are very different in their aesthetic and their look to Tasmanian Aboriginals. And the response was, the director's done her research, she knows what she wants. This director has now been applauded, which is tied into my first question, for being a female director. And often, this is part of the conversation that is missing in terms of intersectional politics.
Thank you. You've certainly raised some a very complex and thought-provoking point of view there. Does anyone want to? It's hard to address that without almost starting a second panel. There's a lot there to unpack. Any comments off the top there, John?
Yeah, I mean, thanks for that, Sharon. Really awesome questions. And, you know, there are big things to unpack around that, which is unable to be answered in a panel. I don't have answers, but, you know, like it is that thing about voice, you know, and we talk about, and, you know, people having the voice to tell their own stories. And, you know, I had an experience with a theatre show that I directed in Western New South Wales with two elders in Narromine, a little country town. And the elder was a shearer back in the day, so he'd worked a lot in a lot of small towns, a lot of properties, shearing and stuff. And he felt for the first time he could tell his story. He's in his 70s. And you know, like he's a quiet spoken person, and you know, and I thought, oh, this would be interesting for him to actually tell his story for this thing. And the reason I did that instead of actors was just there was something about just his voice in telling that. And we had all these farmers, because I wondered how it would go, and it was at an RSL on a Friday night in Narromine in a drought, right? And it was just packed. Like we had 80 seats, we had 120 seats, and then it was like 200, and we got every seat in the house that we could get, and then people were standing, and there was all these farmers who came in, and I was sort of, I suppose, my own bit of racism, I guess, or I don't know, like sometimes like it's easy just to get frustrated with this country. And I saw all these farmers coming in, and I was like, well, here you go. This is not an audience I'm used to seeing in Melbourne or in the cities, you know? And a lot of these fellas had come here for the first time, you know? And I thought, I wonder how they're going to go listening to the story. And I watched them, you know, and I watched the audience, and there's this old fellow, he spoke about the racism that occurred to him in these communities, you know, and where small towns where people live side by side, and people sat and people listened to it, you know, and I just thought, well, there you go. That was, you know, like it was interesting for me to experience that at an RSL on a Friday night, and that people were up for the conversation. And I had these old farmers in their 70s who said, you know, we had heard of things going on, but I didn't know these stories until I heard them tonight, you know, and the process for him to be able to tell that story was also a healing process. And a lot of our communities, I think what Sis is saying too, it's not just telling the story. There is a part of a healing that happens when people tell stories. And often as story makers, or, you know, you just want to dive in, give me the story and I'm out. Like, that's not where it sits with our people. Like, like when Trina was asking the question, like, these hold and they sit in places. And I think what happens too much in this country is they're, like, those farmers and that, they're not coming to hear these stories. Somehow we kept separated. And it's in the interest of people to keep us separated and to not have conversations. And that's what I think something we just need to jerry as a nation, that there's people are keeping us purposely apart, you know, and I think, you know, like, because when people can come together in those and, you know, they have these conversations, I'm not saying that, you know, it's going to heal the world or whatever, but it just allows for people to actually just breathe out, relax and go, we can have a conversation around this.
Is it possible also that with the emergence of, low-budget indie filmmaking platforms online, etc., that maybe that democratisation of distribution is going to allow young voices and underrepresented voices to find their audiences more directly and not need to go through these institutions? Cameron, what do you think?
It's funny you shoot that question to me, because something that I think a lot about as a critic, for example, is just taking a genre like comedy, why I would rather watch goofballs on TikTok and their short 7-second or 13-second films than most studio-produced, glossy, expensive, huge apparatus films. Why, like, you know, and also just the fact that, I guess, speaking as a Black American, just something that a lot of us are aware of in the U.S., a lot of people of color in the U.S. are aware of, is how much more innovative we're allowed to be in those spaces, be it Twitter or Instagram or Vine when that was still allowed to thrive. But just that's something I've been thinking a lot about, because I just wonder, you know, it's something I text my friends about, and I look to see if the people that are doing interesting work in those spaces get support beyond that, or just what happens when Vine shuts down and people don't have access to the stuff they made anymore, or they had to archive it, or maybe they didn't. How do they get found? How do they take the talent that they have? Like, people just teaching themselves things like jump cuts, or things that people feel, you know, teach you that you only learn in film school, or things that people were naturally, of their own accord, on their own instincts doing, which shows that you don't really need the institutional structures to teach you how to make movies, because you intuit, you watch movies, or you consume art, you know how you want to tell your story, you experiment, you're given those spaces. And so I think a lot about that, just like, how do we get that talent to making bigger things, if that's what people want to do? Or, you know, how do we create like a pipeline from there to people just having better access to bigger things? And I know it's not a matter of people using these apps not having the wherewithal or the interest, but it does seem largely to be a matter of the fact that, I mean, as you asked earlier in your question, just a generational gap, and people not knowing that that's talent, and not knowing that that's skill being displayed, and not knowing that they should be hiring those people.
I think, though, if they're attracting an audience, that's what counts. I think whatever the form, if you've got enough followers.
Maybe. I mean, if they're doing it for the likes, but I think a lot of people are doing it to experiment and to express themselves and to make art. I mean, there are definitely people who are just on Instagram for likes, which is about to disappear, so I don't know what they're gonna do. But I mean, I spend a lot of time watching people do crazy crap on TikTok that is so inventive. I mean, it's pathetic that I spend a lot of time on TikTok. But in truth, that's just where a lot of innovative, interesting personalities, performers, that's just where a lot of that stuff is. And sometimes those people do sort of become YouTube stars, I guess. But I'm just curious to see if there's a way that we can make that happen in a more structured, clear way, just make that a clearer pathway to talent discovery, to funding, to getting bigger projects. Because it is, yes, people are absolutely making projects on their iPhones and learning the craft in these lower budget ways that is deeply important. But I think if you take the generation of people who, 10 years ago were making a lot of low budget films, many of them are making bigger things now because they were recognizable to the industry in a particular way.
And
now
they got into the right festivals and won the right prizes.
Right, they like kind of got
Yep.
fed into this another system, but we're not really doing that right now for the current people who are making low budget experimental work. So I just, something I think that the industry, I don't know that the industry is thinking about it, but I think that certainly as the earlier question pointed out, younger people are.
Well, I think that's a really interesting question for the festival to contemplate for next time round. It certainly could be a future panel. We are over time, and so I'm sorry to wind it up, but I think we'd better. I'd like to thank those members of the audience who shared with us and asked questions, and thank you very much to our panellists. It's been a fascinating discussion with you guys, and of course we've got a few films to catch next week and the week after. So Vi will be showing next week, Tuesday evening and Thursday afternoon. Animals has one screening left this Sunday. Out of Range will be showing as part of the MIFF Shorts program this Sunday and next Tuesday. Sophie, In My Blood It Runs. When can we see that?
It's got a screening on Friday, the 17th. I think that's Friday.
Friday the 17th. And Water Shield, John?
I think that's next Friday as well.
Next Friday. All details on the MIFF website, of course. Thanks again for coming, everyone. And thank you to MIFF for hosting our event and the Wheeler Centre. And we hope you enjoy the rest of the festival. Good night. Thanks.